Hi, good evening to everyone. Thank you for joining me. And today I'm talking about something that is very important in terms of population risk. And again, I always make it clear that these are my opinions, although about 4 years ago, I predicted where we're likely to be with certain infections. And it was strangely simply about an extrapolation of the science. I was one of the earliest people to first mention that concept of shedding, where people talk about vaccine shedding and so on. And at the time, I had made the point that it was likely to be exosomal transfer of RNA through saliva, which makes sense because it can get into saliva. But I didn't think it was necessarily clinically significant. Possibly could cause some people to have reactions, sensitivities, but not a major issue. However, what I'm talking about here now is far more serious, and it is what again I predicted based on an extrapolation of the science, because it was clear that even in 2021, that what I was seeing was some degree of immune suppression that would occur because of specific interventions, and you have to learn to read between the lines. And that combination of immune suppression would mean that certain infections would have a very high risk of becoming pretty serious across the population. So, what I'm going to be sharing with you today is a preprint paper that has come out of Pakistan. And it gives us an indication as to what we're likely to be faced in the next number of years. It's very difficult to put timelines. As I said, I thought in 2021 that this would be a bigger issue within a year or two. It looks as though it's 4 or 5 years. And so when we talk about population level risks, it may be 5 to 10 years. I don't know. The point being is that if we don't get better at anticipating these things, they will continue to hit us over and over, and you will be the one to suffer. So in this paper here, um, this is looking at dysregulated, this IFN gamma, interferon gamma, interleukin 6, tumor necrosis factor alpha, after COVID-19, suggestive of lowered innate immune responses to SARS-CoV-2 and Mycobacterium TB. So this is a very important paper, and one of the first times that somebody has actually tried to properly look at this. So I'm going to come back to that in a second. And just to highlight a few things as to why this is such an important conversation. So I've got a few slides, and they're there to just help you to understand what it is that we are up against. So TB, Mycobacterium tuberculosis, is one heck of a bacteria. In effect, the reason that it caused so much carnage in the past is because our immune system can't really fight it. That's the reality. Very few people can clear this bacteria because it is so good. It is exceptionally old. It's an ancient bacteria. It has learned how to evade immunity. And the best, largely, you can hope for is to contain it. And the problem is that it is not easy to spread, but in someone who is contagious, it can be spread. And that then means it goes on to people who then have to fight this for life, so to speak. In that sense, it's almost like a bacterial form of HIV, because you just can't get rid of it. It is a sophisticated bacteria, as I said. It has almost a perfect cell wall that the immune system just cannot degrade when it tries to break it down. And so it spreads from person to person, usually coughs, sneezes, if somebody is infected. But what we're seeing these days is that presentation of disease seems to have changed significantly. And what I predicted a number of years ago, that one of the diseases that I expected to be a problem for the population would be TB, largely because I recognize that regulatory cells are being damaged and dysfunctional, and also effector immune cells in the body after SARS-CoV-2 infection. So, what I had put together was an example of what happens in a granuloma, because that's what the immune system does. Because it can't get rid of it, it then puts it and locks it away in a granuloma. And this is what an immune related granuloma looks like. And in the center of it here are all the TB bacteria. Some are inside macrophages, but they can't digest them. So they're just stuck. And then it forms a wall of immune cells around it, a circular wall, and all the way on the end are, so these are macrophages all the way inside. You have giant cells, you have neutrophils, then you have lymphocytes on the outside. And this is an example of a granuloma because the immune system can't digest it, can't beat it, can't break it down. And so instead of fighting it, it just locks it away. That's the strategy that the immune system uses. So, for many people, they have got latent tuberculosis. It's there, but it's not causing any problems. It doesn't spread because the bacteria are locked away. So, when I was looking at the example here, I was then showing the difference with regards to an unstable granuloma. And in this case, I was saying these dark cells represent, compared to the other side, regulatory cells that are no longer as effective. You then have hyperactive macrophages, which then get exhausted. And this whole thing then starts to break down. It can't keep the bacteria in check. And then this is now the risk that bacteria can escape from these granulomas and spread. And hopefully, then the immune system will try and lock it down again. But in theory, you can end up with a situation where someone is able to cough droplets out, and this could then cause TB to spread. So, we have had a relatively stable period of time for a long time because of the BCG vaccine. So, the BCG vaccine triggers the immune system to be more reactive against TB, and as a result, more effective at locking it away, not necessarily getting rid of it. So, when we look at what happened in Pakistan, you have to realize that Pakistan is therefore a region that has much higher endemic TB. So, this is why it was an interesting study that was done there. And they highlighted in the paper here Pakistan is highly endemic TB country with a frequency of latent TB infections, LTBI, ranging from 30% in the community to 70% among household contacts. So this is in place. Now, it's not just Pakistan. TB is all across the world, and especially relevant in terms of HIV communities as well. TB can become quite a serious issue. And so they decided that they were going to study what happened in a vaccinated cohort. That's very interesting because they declare that they were looking specifically at a cohort of people who were actually vaccinated. This, I think, is something important that I always say that you need to do with your studies, because the immune response is likely to be different long term. And this is the reality. And there's no easy fix to this because the immune system seems to be locked in position. But you can see here that when they looked at the demographic characteristics of the study groups, they looked at the period of enrollment, 22 to 23, as well as their COVID-19 vaccination status received by the study participants in 2021 to 2022. And they were comparing people who had exposure, no prior history of COVID. And it's not that they didn't have exposure, they didn't have any symptoms, with those who actually had COVID. This wasn't a big study. So it's 20 and 20. Here you can see that. So it's not a big study, but it's one of the first studies of its kind like this that was looking at what happened in terms of immune responses between different groups. And what they found was that when they looked at the outcomes, and this is just from the abstract here, and remember this is a preprint, so it still has to go through its peer review. But they were looking at investigating the association between COVID-19 and latent tuberculosis infection. They were looking at healthy controls as well as people who had COVID-19. They didn't describe the severity. That's a gap in terms of their the quality of the study, but otherwise, they looked at spike-induced interferon responses, interleukin responses, interleukin 6 and interleukin 2. And what they found is that the levels were reduced in people who had COVID-19 compared to controls. It would have been very interesting to see the difference between the unvaccinated, the vaccinated who had no obvious COVID, and the vaccinated who had COVID. That to me would have been a perfect study. But they were then looking at the fact that the spike induced higher cytokine levels in people who are already positive with regards to interferon gamma release assay. And they noticed that the levels were lowered in people who had COVID-19 infection. So, in effect, they are recognizing that in the cohort of people, and at the moment, I mean, some people may argue about this, but these are the facts. They are looking at a vaccinated cohort. We don't know if it is the same with the unvaccinated cohort. My suspicion is that it wouldn't necessarily be the same. But what they are seeing is that in a vaccinated cohort who had COVID, you are then seeing a degree of immune suppression post-COVID up to, I think, 37 months after the infection. So you can see here reduced SARS-CoV-2 and Mycobacterium TB activation of inflammatory cytokines reflects down-regulated immunity after COVID. Further studies are required to assess whether latent TB and COVID increase the risk, so the long-term risk of progression to active tuberculosis. So at the moment, that is just purely speculation. However, as I said, we're going ahead of putting the pieces together. It just so happens that I spoke about this just a few days ago. The incidence of respiratory infections after the COVID-19 pandemic in Korea, looking at its entire population, 2023 to 2024. So we are looking for patterns here that could be relevant, that we could extrapolate on to help us to understand what's going on. And I recently spoke about this in relation to what happened with whooping cough or pertussis. And you can see here, this is in Korea now, in terms of cases, monthly incidence of infection, up to 60,000 per month. And what you can see, 2016 to 2024, it was almost at zero all the way through the pandemic, up until suddenly in 2024, this massive surge, up to 60,000 cases per month, most in younger people. And they found that they vaccinated over 4 doses had a 94% reduction in cases. For me, that suggested that it's not that they weren't getting infected, especially based on the fact that we can see that immunity is lowered. They just start having symptoms. And so that was a risk, in my view, a population risk, because you have asymptomatic people who are circulating bacteria, or viruses to other people. This then, because Korea also looked at tuberculosis. So the point I'm making here is that what Pakistan is making reference to is being reflected in the data in Korea. And this is what Korea found around the same time. They are looking at the cases from 2016. Here we can see this gradual decrease, and you can see the trajectory here is going down. And then here in about January 2021, it may be purely a coincidence, of course, suddenly it shifts from that trend line and starts to go across, and it's in effect a 47% increase in cases of tuberculosis from what was anticipated in Korea. So this fits with what Pakistan is seeing. And you have to remember, Korea is not a highly endemic region. So here's the tie together, the reality. We've got a problem here that is not easy to fix. I don't know what the fix is, because if we have a situation where the immune system has been compromised by the intervention, it means that that compromised immune system is going to have recurring SARS-CoV-2 infections. Each infection is weakening the immunity further. And what we then have is, at a population level, increased risk of circulation of viruses and bacteria. A cold, you can understand. Even influenza, you can get over. Now remember this, something like TB, you never get past it. Your immune system locks it down, but it can't get rid of it. That, to me, is one of the highest risks at a population level. I would hope that the public health is looking into this and finally acknowledging that, okay, we need to do something about this. Now, what the answer is, we really need to know what cohort in the vaccinated specifically are struggling with immune responses. Because if we can identify, we can try and help to strengthen their immunity, identify the risks that may be occurring by looking and screening for viral or bacterial infections, so that they don't become a risk to everyone else. If you are unvaccinated, a lot of people feel very confident about the fact that they're fine with COVID. You can't do the same kind of thinking when it comes to things like TB and whooping cough and mycoplasma, because your immunity is dependent on your prior exposure. I don't know what the perfect answer is, but I don't want you to take it lightly. You've got to take it seriously if you are in high exposure environments. I am not a huge advocate for masking all the time, but sometimes we have to think of it as a possibility. And this is one of those flip situations where now it may be that the unvaccinated have to protect themselves against everyone else. Strange as it may seem, this seems to be where we're heading. There are no easy answers, and I will think about what people can do in terms of simple strategies. One of them, which I always make reference to, is about humming. It is the simplest thing anyone can do. It improves the antiviral, antibacterial effect in your sinuses. There's a free ebook about it. We want you to purchase. The main thing, share it with family and friends. Tell them about the importance of nitric oxide and humming. It will help everybody. My view, and the reason we did that book, was because I thought that that story of using humming to protect the population is such a beautiful and simple concept that it's something that we should all try and see if we can achieve. There's a long road ahead, and I don't have all the answers. But one thing is for certain, when we extrapolate the science, we have a lot of challenges to overcome. Have a great evening.
A hero, an immune adventure. Humming Heroes, your lyrical guide to the body's defenders. Now on Amazon. Check the links below.